Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this morning's webinar.
Good morning.
In the pilot's chair today is myself, Dave Beattie, and my first officer is Karen van den Bergh. Just a little bit about us. I've been in the legislative compliance space for 26 years, and Karen's got considerably more than that. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to go through issues that we see on a day-to-day basis as being hugely important for your average business. They're often issues that are neglected or ignored for various reasons, which we'll cover shortly, but they're issues that are potentially catastrophic for a business in terms of cost if they're not dealt with. The seminar is called HR and People Risk Assessment and Solutions. So we're going to look at a couple of spaces. We're going to look at the payroll space, we're going to look at the HR space, and we're going to see how those two spaces coexist in your average business and where the challenges are. Often there's not very good communication between those two sections, and when an organization such as HR Talk come in, we identify those challenges. The webinar is going to probably be about 40 minutes long. We're going to go through the issues, and you're welcome to ask your questions. We'll deal with the questions at the end. And you are more than welcome to contact us after the webinar if there's any issues that are concern to you or issues that you have in your own business, or particularly if you have never thought of some of these issues that you would like looked at, and we can certainly assist you. We're going to start with looking at some legislation, and in terms of legislation, South Africa has potentially some of the best legislation in the world. Unfortunately, it's no good having the best legislation if you can't comply. Sorry, we're just having a couple of issues here with the slides. I'm going to just continue. When the slides are up and running, we'll have a look. There they go. Okay, so going back to legislation, we take legislation from all your first world countries, and South Africa is known to be at the forefront of legislation. Legislation is introduced at a rapid rate, but in my second bullet point, I ask, is this legislation sufficient, or does it fit a country like South Africa where we have such inequality? Now, you all have your own thoughts on this, but in my space and in my dealings with legislation, a lot of the times the legislation is introduced, and it's introduced without applying South African considerations to that legislation. We just look at often legislation such as, as an example, the employment tax incentive legislation that was introduced in 2013. It was introduced for political reasons. The government clearly wanted to be compassionate and be seen to be working towards creating employment, so they introduced this legislation. Unfortunately, the legislation was introduced without the right amount of interaction with your payroll companies, organizations such as the Payroll Authors Group, and as a result, we've had 7 years of drama with legislation being amended every single year over that period. That creates huge frustrations in the payroll space, and it complicates issues for people who are trying to manage their payroll. Just as an example, if you're a payroll administrator and you know your job, there's very little chance that you're going to know the intricacies of ETI to the level that the legislation provides. With the COVID-19 legislation that we've had, we've seen that, quite frankly, I sometimes battle to understand what the legislation is saying. And we have this backward and forward with the Payroll Authors Group and SARS trying to get to the bottom of it. So it's hugely problematic to have this legislation hanging over people's heads in the payroll and HR space, But what we're going to do is we're going to unpack some of the threats a bit later that you can look at, as they're the most important. My third bullet, I talk about legislation is only as good as the people who police it. Now, that is very true. If you look at SARS as an example, SARS was a beacon an example of how a government organisation should actually work. It was always the shining light in the government basket, and we've seen the decline in standards. We've seen the corruption move into the space over the years, and we've seen that they are no longer at the forefront of legislative compliance.
This is the last slide.
Yeah. So I just want to get back to the slides so we can. Okay, so we're on bullet point 3. We're only as good as the people who police it. So we've seen SARS declined. We've never really had much faith in the Department of Labour or the Compensation Commissioner, because their communication is very, very poor. And a lot of their legislation, although promulgated, hasn't been applied from Labour Centre to Labour Centre. So we've got legislation from 2017 signed off by President Zuma, the president at the time, that is still lingering and not being applied across the board. So once again, you'll implement legislation, you'll cry from the rooftops about how awesome it is, but you don't apply it. So people getting unemployed are not going to get the benefits that they are entitled to. So the legislation is there and it needs to be adhered to, and you do not want to be the employer that has legislation thrown in your face. So we're going to go through a couple of issues to help you get out of that bind. The competing challenges facing South African business owners. We're probably at the most turbulent time of our history in terms of having muddy water. If you look at the challenges faced by South Africa as an economy, the downgrading, with all the ratings agencies, economic challenges from a government perspective. You've got competing factions in governments in terms of turning the country around. We're in a very difficult place. So at the bottom of that pyramid, you've got your employers who are desperately trying to make money to survive. They've got employees and they need to pay those employees. Without employees, families don't get money. So we've got a rather challenging situation in that the economy is forcing companies out of business. They are putting employees on the streets, and those employees are then obviously going to government for benefits in terms of UIF. So we've got problems. What does your employer do now? Does he survive or does he manage legislative compliance? And our angle is going to be that you need to do both. You need to pay attention to both. And I'm not saying 80% of your time on legislative compliance issues. Obviously, survival is more important, but there are ways of dealing with legislative compliance that don't cost a lot of money. We're going to look at those. We see firsthand the attitude of legislative compliance in particularly the UIF, Workmen's Comp and HR space. As I said, SARS were awesome at one stage, their crown has slipped, and we see more and more companies taking tax compliance chances. So why is the attitude to legislative compliance so poor? Is there other problems? Now, we believe that there's numerous reasons for poor compliance, and in 2013, I actually did a dissertation on the reasons for outsourcing, and the results were very, very interesting. And some of those findings are in the slide presentation today. The main ones are lack of awareness. People open businesses, they've got the entrepreneurial streak, they want to make money, they create employment, they do all the first things right, okay, but they are unaware of legislation. That comes back to bite them. Down the line, there's lots of issues, there's lots of loose ends, and they get punished. Inadequate skills. Very, very important point. It was covered in my dissertation. What is adequate skills? Now, Karen will tell you from a payroll perspective, to get a person who is competent in the payroll space, someone who understands a bit of all the legislation, can problem solve, and deal with SARS, you're probably looking at about 35,000 rand a month for that person.
15 years.
And 15 years experience, Karen.
Yeah.
Okay, so 15 years experience, a person with that type of experience wants big money. So if you're a smallish business, can you afford to absorb 35,000 rand a month as someone just dealing with your payroll space? Now that person is not an HR person, so you would also need an HR person, which is potentially going to cost you more because obviously the legislation is a lot wider. My next point is the cost of compliance considerations. A lot of people get stuck on cost, and we're not going to debate the run your payroll in-house versus outsourcing at length here, but the cost to set up a payroll system in terms of your licensing, having the necessary consultants come out, set things up correctly, do your annual considerations is quite high. And traditionally, that is one of the biggest drivers of the outsource, that and the risk of non-compliance. So compliance is a big issue. It cannot just be ignored. It is a ticking time bomb if you choose to ignore it. Unwillingness to comply, we do have that. The old school, there are quite a few people who sometimes mix political rhetoric and legislative compliance. If you're not going to comply, you're not going to comply. We can't really help you. But obviously, as a compliance person, I do my best to ensure that people understand compliance and do comply. Whilst the reason for non-compliance is not important, what is important to note is that this non-compliance will raise its head sooner rather than later. So enter the COVID-19 pandemic. Who would have thought that at the beginning of this year, we would be where we are now? We all entered 2020 slightly gun shy in terms of what was going to happen to the economy. We've seen businesses closing. We've seen, obviously, job shrinkage. But who would have thought that this disaster, COVID-19, would happen? I mean, I think generally in the very beginning it was a bit exciting for people, but business owners are not stupid. They saw the challenges that were going to happen, and your good business owners obviously were quick to get out of the starting blocks and put in place processes to get through this process. Now, what we've seen in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, government's quick out of the blocks, introduced the tours legislation, all great. Unfortunately, we all know that the government doesn't have a good track record of actually implementing what they preach. So we anticipated those challenges, but obviously this is not a government bashing process. We're looking at the employer. In our interactions with companies, Karen and I, we're quite familiar with the UIF and COI legislation, and we've been beating the drum for years that you need to comply in a certain way because things are linked. And as members of the Payroll Authors Group, we've seen how every single year that link becomes stronger. So whilst you might not have any faith in these organizations, they are starting to talk to each other. So the days of you fobbing off one and lying to the other are over. So quite quickly we saw the challenges relating to UIF. Companies confidently came forward and asked us for assistance with TERS applications, and after a considerable wait, they were disappointed because they were rejected. So we looked at reasons for the rejections, and it was quite obvious that they were non-compliant from either reporting or declaration perspective. And I spent 3 weeks in that early process, furiously doing UIF registrations with the Department of Labour. So in our travels, talking to clients and potential clients, we've been telling them that paying the UIF to SARS is very, very different to submitting your declaration to the Department of Labour. So you have a situation where you've paid your money to SARS and you think that's all great. What you don't realise is SARS has to pay that money to the Department of Labour against the UIF number at the Department of Labour. So your money, whilst paid, might go to the Department of Labour and sit in a suspense account for the rest of your life. It doesn't get allocated. So when your employees go to claim benefits, there's huge drama and your unhappiness because they can't qualify for claims. If you are running your payroll correctly or you're outsourcing your payroll, you are submitting your UIF declaration file to the Department of Labour on a monthly basis. And what that does is that updates their record. So at the end of that month, the Department of Labour are quite clear as to what the money that they received relates to. Your employees, what is their status, and that all works on a obviously credits basis. Now we all know that TERS didn't work on a credits basis, but I'm looking at situations where a person might want to claim short time or they were ill. They're going to have a problem claiming if you do not have your declaration files up to date. Now we had other challenges with the declaration files, but I'm just talking big picture. So the frustrations on TERS, a lot of them can be directly attributed to non-compliance in your employer space. Karen wanted to mention the UIF legislation, the Main Act and the Contribution Act.
Yeah, just basically to say that there's two acts that govern unemployment. The one is the Main Act, which governs how those credits are allocated to the individuals. So we submit files on a monthly basis to EDEC, all right, and those credits are allocated to each individual. That is contained in the Main Act. The Contributions Act is actually the payment. So we found that the majority of companies are only complying with the Contributions Act. They're not complying with the Main Act.
Thank you, Karen. And those of you in the space will know that the limits applicable to the two acts are different. And I'm not going to go into that. But you'll know that one is 14,000 and another one is 17,000. So to summarise that, how much importance do business owners place on legislative compliance in the UIF space? We've seen the attitude is pretty poor. So I think prior to this, a lot of employers didn't. How they got through the system, I'm not quite sure, but I think we were looking at contribution schedules. If you've been submitting your declaration file, you don't have to do any contribution schedules to Labour, and the process should be quite easy. Do they know the criteria of how UIF is deducted? Do they know the consequences? Do they understand what an employee is? Yeah.
Can I say something there, David? Okay, so where we found a huge amount of issues, especially during the COVID pandemic, is that a lot of clients don't seem to understand that as soon as an employee works for them for 24 hours within a month, you have to make a UIF contribution for that employee. So we have had in this space perhaps casuals or part-time workers that have been working for a client for maybe 3 or 4 years. They're not on the payroll, they're being paid out of petty cash, and those people at this point are unable to claim. So they've gone to who they believe is their employer, and they've not been able to claim because no deductions have been made from those employees. So I'll give you an example, for schools, for argument's sake, where they have sports coaches in the afternoon. That sports coach may work at maybe 17 different schools, depending on the season for his sport. All of those employers should be contributing to UIF for that.
So they have to look at
yes.
the hours that they work and make a decision.
Correct.
Okay, so in our health checks that Karen and I do of businesses, we see very, very poor compliance in this area. And if you look at a lot of employers, if you're a manufacturing concern and you're pulling people from outside your main gates every day. I remember from my SARS work, the days when I worked at SARS, no records are kept. At the end of the day, someone goes with a fistful of cash and hands out $150, $100, and those people go away. You are violating their rights to claim UIF if you are not processing them through the payroll if they work more than 24 hours a month.
Correct. The other issues have been around non-South Africans.
Yes.
So where people are not South Africans, they're entitled to work here, they've got the correct papers, and they're entitled, and they should be deducting UIF, but they've had problems claiming now because those records are not complete. And so there's a number of issues in that area. So
I think the lesson to be learned, it's probably a better idea to have what we call fixed casuals.
Mm-hmm.
So you would pull the same guys in because you would need a copy of their ID and you need to put certain legislatively required information into your payroll, and you let your payroll deduct the UIF. A lot of people are loath to do that because they don't want to do the administration. They also see those people as almost disposable entities in that they are never going to claim UIF. They can be working elsewhere or roaming the streets. Unfortunately, as Karen said, quite rightfully, those guys could be working 3-4 days a week all over the place, and combined, those UIF payments that are being made would give them sufficient credits in periods where they're unemployed to claim benefits. So you are denying them benefits. So you're going to have a situation where not only SARS are going to potentially throw out your tax deduction for a portion of your wages because you don't have documentation to prove who you've had there. And if you do have the documentation, you're going to be non-compliant if you haven't applied the 24-hour rule.
The other area where we've seen quite a lot of issues, David, has been with union contractors during this space and UIF. So I don't know if you want to speak into that area a little. Which is, are they genuinely independent? Yes. Because when something like COVID happens, everybody will go to the easiest source to try and claim income. So in a lot of spaces, they haven't applied, or the employer hasn't applied their minds. And now the employee who didn't want to be an employee in the past is now stating that they are an employee. And quite rightly so, they are.
Good point, Karen. We've had lots of situations where long-term independent contractors who we know in terms of the tax legislation are not independent, are very happy to take their 15,000, 20,000 rand a month tax-free home. When the pawpaw hits the fan, as Karen said, with COVID, the company can no longer pay salaries. They then now switch coats. They are now an employee in their own house. So as an employer, it's not worth taking that risk. There's only going to be one loser in this process, and that is going to be the employer. So don't do what's expedient at the time, do what's right at the time. We move on to the next one, which Karen will also talk into. Workmen's compensation. Workmen's compensation is a hugely problematic thing. We've got a workmen's comp system that you register for, and the non-compliance in this space is horrendous. You register, you submit an annual return, and you pay a relatively small fee to cover those employees and the company in the case of an injury or sickness or death on duty. What happens though is there's not compliance in this area. The pawpaw hits the fan, and then there's challenges.
Okay, so I've had a number of unpleasant experiences in this space. One of them related to a young man who had been employed by the same business on what they determined to be a casual basis for the last maybe 2-3 years. There was a horrible accident involved, and they tried to claim for this employee through COID. Okay, they had never declared him for UIF, so Department of Labour couldn't find him on the EDEC database. And when they had a look at the workmen's compensation return at the end of the year, it was quite clear that this man's earnings had never been declared and had no insurance. had ever been paid. This man was 22 years old and had lost both his legs. So that was a terrible, terrible one. One that was related directly to COVID that I got a phone call about early on in the pandemic was about locums employed in a medical practice. The practice had assumed that these locums were independent contractors. From a PAYE perspective, from a UIF perspective, and from a workman's comp perspective. The horror story was that they actually weren't covered in their own right because they were sole props and therefore couldn't register for workman's comp
or UIF.
Or UIF. And the family, one of these young men had actually contracted COVID, was in hospital on a respirator, and the family were coming to the medical practice for loss of earnings and for medical bills as well. I have no idea what has happened, but that was a huge problem. And I think just lastly, one area that I think is a big problem is in a number of organisations that we work with, they have volunteers. So these are people that volunteer. So I'm going to talk specifically about organisations like SPCA or schools or areas like that, where you have mums or people working in a tea garden and that kind of thing. Now, there's clearly no loss of earnings if that person had to be injured.
Because they were volunteers.
Because they're volunteers, okay. But they certainly have a claim back to the organisation for their hospital bills if there was an accident or, God forbid, they contracted COVID or whatever it is. Often these volunteers are not young people, they're a little bit older and they've got more time on their hands, so they're volunteering a certain amount of time. What we've been doing for our clients is entering into that space and asking them to please give us a register of those people and their ID numbers so that we can keep them on file as being declared if there would be some sort of problem. If that's done, you are then covering the civil risk that would be picked up by the employer should something happen to those individuals. So you need to spend quite a lot of time looking at your organisation, looking at the various individuals that you've got that are attached, that may not be in your mind employees, but having a look at the risk and how you can cover that, because we've seen so much devastation during this COVID time.
I think to conclude that issue, Karen hit the nail on the head, the civil claim. By you paying workmen's compensation, you cannot be attacked civilly for an issue. So any issue would have to go through the workmen's compensation system. They might try and look at negligence on your behalf, but that's a separate system. As Karen said, you do not want a case where a 22-year-old person loses their legs, cannot work ever again in their life, and you do not want a court to sit and determine what that person's lifetime medical costs are going to be and what their loss of earnings is going to be. Because the next thing, you've got a 10 million rand claim because you did not want to pay a couple of $100 for the year for that person's workman's comp. So you need to be very careful here. You shouldn't be weighing the cost of workman's comp to the risk. Workman's comp is a law. Every business, the day they start, the day they employ their first employee, have to be registered for COID. Okay, so moving on to payroll compliance. Almost every single week I come across a situation where I talk to a payroll administrator and they tell me, yes, but we use VIP or one of the Sage products or SAP. So things are right. Working in the payroll space, I know that is not true. Your payroll is only as good as the person who uses it and the person who sets it up. And whether that person understands legislation or attends a tax seminar with their software supplier once a year, and that's their only mental stimulation in terms of learning, you are on a hiding to nothing and probably putting your employer at massive risk. I've got a family member who's bought a business and quite a big business and quite a big hardware chain. And I spoke to his payroll administrator when TERS came out, and I was shocked by her general lack of understanding of systems. And I said to him, you need to put in place compliance there because you're exposing your business to huge risk. You know, you said the lady had been there 20 years and she was an awesome person and a great employee. You know, be that as it may, she won't be a great employee if SARS or the Department of Labour gets stuck into you. So it's very important to look at that, look at the quality of the payroll input. Is it correct? Are systems being followed? Because remember, poor information in is going to be poor information out. It is important to have, as I said, experienced payroll administrators anticipating all the challenges. Every time something changes, they need to be on top of it. They need to communicate. They need to bring in experts if they have to. We do what we call, and I'll discuss it a little bit more at the end, a payroll HR health check. And this is quite a good way of determining the risk of that payroll. And we, after 5 minutes of conversation, will know whether that person is quite light in terms of legislative compliance and understanding. So a lot of employers are keen to see where the holes are in their organisation, and are not just willing to accept the word of the payroll administrator that VIP, for example, have got their back. Karen,
I think this is just another point to be careful of. It's another risk point. So during COVID, we've seen a lot of employers negotiate a change in their retirement contributions. Okay, there seemed to be a general lack of understanding that part of those contributions covered disability and illness. Okay, so whether they negotiated a 12% or a 10% or whatever that might have been, a decrease in their contributions, it was important for us to remind the client that the risk portion needed to remain intact, okay, in case of illness or death. So otherwise the employer would be vulnerable to civil claims.
So what you're saying is the decrease is going to give them decreased coverage.
Yes.
And in the case of a death,
yes,
the family are going to be
yes,
out of pocket.
Yeah.
They're not going to get 75% of the person's normal earnings. They're going to get 50% because of a poor decision made at company level.
Yes. So what my suggestion here is to speak very carefully to whoever it is that is looking after the fund, and make sure that you understand that clearly before giving an instruction or putting it through your payroll.
This is very linked to the one above,
yes,
with a payroll understanding, like Karen's saying. It's no good saying, Alexander Forbes had my back. Alexander Forbes are a service provider to you. They will do as they're told. So if they're told to reduce something by 20%, they're going to do it. You need to understand the implication to your organisation. And
on the portal and whatever it is that you remit, that the risk contributions don't change.
Yes.
That they're based on the original salary. I think that's important.
Okay. Moving on to the basic conditions of employment, we cover all these issues in the health check, and we see how poorly organisations do in this respect. HR is the poor cousin in terms of the effort and the money that's spent on it in an organisation. That's quite clear. And management traditionally, as I said, don't give much attention to it, and as a result, compliance suffers. So what I've done is I've just identified a couple of areas where we, in our experience, see poor non-compliance. Contracts of employment is the first one. Often we see contracts of employment that are 15 years old. The legislation doesn't stand still. You know, nothing worse than even a SARS auditor coming in and asking for your contract of employment to glean tax-related issues out of there to see something that was dated 12, 15 years ago. There's no addendums to it. In fact, there comes a time when you have to redo it completely. But at worst, you would have an addendum as issues change to cover, obviously, the employee and the company. But we see not a lot of attention paid there. We often see contracts that are pirated off the internet or a friend. Those contracts have no similarity to what should be happening in the organisation. Policies and procedures clearly reflecting the company's stance on employment issues. Karen and I could tell you a lot of stories here, but the crux of the matter here is if issues are silent, you're going to really battle to tie an employee down to some sort of non-compliance or disciplinary issue. You know, we look at issues such as sexual harassment in the workplace. What is your organization's policy in terms of touching sexual harassment of men and women? But yeah, flirting, inappropriate touching, what is the point? So you have to be so careful, because without a policy, someone's going to say, well, so-and-so does it, and so I'm allowed to do it.
And I think retirement and exiting the organisation is
a good one.
That's one that needs to be concentrated on. It causes a lot of problems with UIF. It causes a lot of problems when somebody reaches an age. There's not even.
And it's silent.
Yeah, when it's silent. Yeah. So those sort of things.
Definitely. Often, well, your policy should clearly show your values. Now, values is a very emotional thing because people's values are different. So pornography in the workplace might be acceptable to someone. They might think that someone else watching football in the workplace is unacceptable. So you need to be very clear that pornography is seen as socially unacceptable and has no place in the workplace. Lack of knowledge regarding leave rules and leave pay. Karen can probably talk for another 2 hours on this issue. It's very, very important that this is put in writing and people understand where they stand. What is right, what is wrong, what's going to be accepted, what's not going to be accepted. Without that line, you have a challenge. Poor understanding around employing foreigners and asylum seekers. Karen, do you?
Yeah, really just understanding the rules around that, understanding who you can employ, the paperwork that you need to have in place. Again, with COVID, I've had a lot of clients say to me, I've got this chap, he comes from Swaziland, I'm not sure if his papers are right, they're too frightened to put in a COVID claim, that kind of thing, but they're excellent employees. Just poor understanding around that. Should they be contributing to UIF? And
also their tax position.
Yes. Absolutely.
You know, a lot of people say that they're foreigners. It doesn't matter if they're foreigners. If they're working in South Africa, they pay tax on their earnings in South Africa.
They pay UIF, and then you should have to have your workers' compensation return. Yeah.
Who are employees? I could talk for a whole week on this topic. So could Karen. You know, the acts are all very, very different, and I know there is a move to get the acts aligned, but you need to know where you stand. Is this person an employee or not? The wrong decision here can be hugely costly.
So a very good example is just a quick example to throw in here is if you work for, as I mentioned previously, if you work 24 hours for an employer within a month, you contribute towards UIF. But even casuals that have worked for 1 minute and volunteers are included for COIC. So you could really not be an employee from a UIF or an income tax perspective, but from a workman's comp perspective, you certainly are an employee and should be treated as such.
Because you're working,
yes,
albeit for 1 minute.
Correct.
In that 1 minute, you could lose your
absolutely.
Okay, we've covered that issue. Inadequate induction procedures. What are the challenges here? I don't know. Will be what you told. No one told me if there's not a proper induction process. And people attack me about this and they say, no, well, you know, this is all nice and warm and fuzzy, but this is a waste of time. No, it's not. You can have a 1-page process, a tick box process. You know, I showed the person their workstation. I showed them where the toilet is. I gave them their contract of employment. I showed them where the policy and procedure manual is. They sign that document, and that document is kept in their file to show that they have had an induction. Because you do not want a situation going to the CCMA where the person says, prove to me that I was told that we were not allowed to watch porn at lunchtime.
Or we had to inform our managers that we weren't coming to work before 8 o'clock in the morning when we started work. Those are common.
So you can avoid a lot of heartache by just filling in a one-page tick box process. Poor understanding around fixed-term contractors and independent contractors. I spend probably about a quarter of my time on issues such as this. Companies make the mistake of bringing someone in as an independent contractor when that person is a fixed-term contractor. I brought in an IT guy for 8 months, but he used an invoice. Do you understand interpretation that's 17 and 35 of the Income Tax Act? No, you don't. That person is a fixed-term contractor. UIF should be deducted. PAY should be deducted. They may not qualify for benefits in terms of your company's rules, but you cannot willy-nilly call a person an independent contractor. No matter how nice your independent contractor agreement is, you cannot break the law in terms of the provisions of a contract. No performance appraisal process. We'll have challenges there when the company chooses to give bonuses or merit awards and you haven't done an appraisal process. Then you'll have accusations of favoritism. So your appraisal system can be as short or as long as you like, as long as it's fair, and you actually need a professional to assist you in this space. Similarly with job grading, are you paying a person the same for doing a similar job? Without a grading process, you on thin ice, you don't have a leg to stand on because you can't prove why you've made a decision. Clearance checks, we see pretty poor compliance in this space. Employees coming into your organization, you're recruiting people into a finance or a really responsible position without doing criminal or financial credit checks on them. It's a relatively small price to pay. The same applies to educational checks. We're told that 2 out of every 5 government employee is in there with false paperwork, so it's definitely worth using a reputable organization to do criminal credits and legislative checks.
You do that?
Yes, we can assist you with that if you need help. The POPI policy. POPI has been around for quite a while now. Legislation, I'm not sure if it's been promulgated yet, but this POPI policy is something that a lot of organizations should be quite far down the road on. And we're just looking at the protection of personal information. It's important that your company protects the various stakeholders in any organization's personal information. We can certainly assist you in that space. And then finally, in this area, there's this organizations are required in terms of the Protected Disclosures Amendment Act to have some sort of internal system for dealing with information about improprieties in a business. So some sort of whistleblowing system, whether that be a box at reception that you can, box that you can pop a note into, or an app, that's up to you, but it's important that you create an environment that allows for that. So this is just a few of the issues that are common to the vast majority of the reviews that we undertake. Okay, quickly, I just want to go back to the HR side of things. So you can see that I've said that it's critically important that HR be given more importance because you do not want a situation where management have to take their eye off the ball of generating revenue, making their businesses successful by spending days in inquiries and at the CCMA. So what we suggest is that more attention is paid to the following areas: employee development and training, employee well-being, provision of employee benefits. I mean, if you're providing good employee benefits, you're an employer of choice. Creating a work environment that is conducive to happy and productive employees. Ensuring staff turnover, that would be linked to the point above. I mean, happy, productive employees are unlikely to want to leave. And important to note that obviously staff turnover is costly for a company, because you're bringing in people who take time to adjust to companies' processes and clients, and that costs money. A flexible remuneration structure, and that's, I would generally say you should have a cost of company approach to remuneration that is flexible and allows the employees flexibility in decision making. An open door policy in terms of complaints, whistleblowing. Sorry. I need to stress. I need to stress that non-compliance and poor HR policies are costing companies money. The cost of senior management is huge. We see it on a daily basis with people saying, we're under stress. I don't know why I got into business, because what I'm having is I'm spending more time dealing with problems than dealing with things that make us money. So it makes sense to pay attention to compliance. It makes sense to look at industry best practice. And as I said earlier, it's not necessarily to spend a lot of money on this. You know, these issues you can spend as much money as you like, but what we prefer to do is look at it and put in place a process that is workable, easy to understand, and is cost effective to the organization. I have mentioned this HR health check. We offer this health check to clients. It's a free health check. It traditionally takes an hour and a half. Obviously with COVID-19, you know, if you'd like to take this opportunity, we can do it via Zoom or Teams, but it's a lot more effective if you do it face to face and you include the role players in your organization. Essentially what it is, it's an opportunity, warts and all, to show what's happening in your organization, with obviously in a safe space. Because I, as a licensed tax practitioner, I obviously cannot give your information to anyone else, but I'll sit with you and I will talk you through the challenges. I'll also do a basic report, bullet points of your areas of non-compliance, and then you can choose how you're going to deal with those, which issues are more important to you, and some sort of a timescale and how you're going to address those issues. So it is a very useful process, and it obviously takes advantage of Karen and my more than 50 years of combined experience, and obviously it provides a shoulder to lean on. So if you would like that, feel free to contact us. You can contact either Karen or myself, and we can schedule some time to do it. We've got to the end of the presentation. I'm just going to have a look at any questions. I see there's no open questions at the moment. As I said in the very beginning, please feel free to contact us. We are available by phone or email. I'm more than happy to chat to you around the process and schedule some time with you. As I said, it'll take an hour to an hour and a half maximum. Thank you for your time, and please keep an eye on our website and our Facebook and any of our flashes. We have webinars every Wednesday, and you're welcome to book on those webinars. Great. Thank you for your time, and have a lovely day. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.